So hello fellow Earthling. This is Earthling 6455463728. And I wanted to talk about the fact that I often hear, well, I make it a point to remind myself when I hear it, that natural selection, we are no longer subject to natural selection. And I think that that is not true. And when people say it, they're not really giving it a lot of thought. I think that we are still subject to natural selection but on a philosophical level, on a, how would you say? Maybe my friends would call it on a cultural level, because we don't have instincts, so we're not being selected for instincts. We probably are being selected for what we learn and how we design our societies, and I guess in some ways that's cultural. And I think it's happening on both a micro and a macro level. So the individual philosophies of, right now we have, supposedly a personal me first rather than a group philosophy, as it's supposed to be playing out in with respect to East countries or Asian countries. And I'm not so sure. I think we'll probably settle somewhere in the middle there. And on a macro level, I think we are also being selected for a philosophy of government that is going to work. Obviously, it's not capitalism. I don't think it can be, because capitalism is pretty much about whoever has the capital rules. And it's not what we have come to think of as a communist society, because in the end it just seems to be that whoever rules the party rules. So that doesn't work either. That's not how it's supposed to work. I think on that level we tend to confuse things. Like we talk about capitalism not capitalism, but we talk about democracy versus communism, when that's not really what it's about. Capitalism is about how you manage resources. It has nothing to do with democracy itself, which is who gets to rule and how you decide who has a vote and so on. Communism is about how you allocate resources as well. So it's really capitalism versus communism. And in a communist country, you can and probably should have democracy of some kind. So I think we mix those things up. But I don't know if I'm going to end up talking about several things at once. One of the things that I wanted to mention was the fact that on a micro level, we are being selected, because once you have a difference in reproductive rates, you are selecting for whatever is causing that difference in reproductive rates. And for example, with respect to education, the more educated people are, the less likely they are to reproduce. So obviously, on a micro level, we are not selecting for education for people who have who see that as something that's important. Doctors, lawyers, and all these other people, they don't have too many kids by and large. You don't have time for too many kids for the most part, unless I think that famous black surgeon, Ben Carson, I think he has a lot of kids. But then again, he's Presbyterian. And again, I think people who are religious probably end up having a lot more kids. I think it's the case for people who are strict Jews. I think it's the case for Arab people with respect to, I think it's with the case with a lot of people. Basically, if you don't spend too much time educating your kids, male or female, they're probably going to reproduce more. So we're not really selecting for what in society we presume are these good things, this higher intelligence and this logical thinking. So also based on the fact that capitalism tends to have this boom and bust period, where every couple decade or so you end up with a recession, and then every couple of recessions you end up with a major depression. That is not helping, as well as the fact that at least currently we are based on an ever continuing amount of growth. And by growth, that just means activity. Do we have more things being mined every year? Do we have more products being created every year? Never mind that most of them are in a garage or in people's attic or in a storage place. We just have this accumulation of more and more and more. And the people who are good, who were lucky and they were able to start what I'll call a business fire, and they were able to accumulate money, they are better because they have more resources at accumulating more money and more and more. And we don't have any limits for how much they can accumulate. And when you're accumulating, you have resources or access to resources that other people don't have. So if you have $1 billion and it's, $1 million to build a house, then you can build 1,000 houses. Whereas somebody else who might actually need a house probably doesn't have enough money to build any. So obviously that doesn't work. Or if with respect to communism you set incentives for people to build rivets and you don't set a limit, and then people realize that okay, instead of putting money towards building plowshares or building cars or building solar panels, we can just make rivets, and whatever we can get access to, we will be famous and lauded and whatever for building these useless rivets. So obviously we need to find a better way to feed back what society really needs into the system, and to avoid this exponential increase of just simple production for the sake of production. But in the same way as we are selecting on a micro level for what kind of personal philosophy works best, and right now we're selecting for people who are not very educated and people who may be very religious and have certain means of applying expectations on people to have kids. On a macro level, unfortunately, we are not really, there is no system in place I see that prevents us from just building more and more and more and more. We have 192 different countries, each of course with a slightly different in some way grand philosophy of whether it is specific versions of democracy or communism or dictatorship. But the more guns a particular country has, and the more farmland they have, the more they can boss around other countries. Well, actually, on a micro level, I don't see things are really too favorable either, because instead of us selecting for intelligence, we aren't, and that was supposed to be the thing that separates us from the animals. But it's funny because I think it was Elon Musk in an interview. He was saying that the cortex, which is where our consciousness lies, our is it the cortex? Well, our prefrontal lobe then. Basically, it's where our intelligence lies, and it's the thing that makes us human and separates us from less developed animals. And he's saying that basically the amygdala, the center for fear and excitement and emotion, basically runs the intelligent part of our brain, meaning that you can rule a human being based on their emotions, and their intelligence basically will just come, rise its head and say, well, this is the reason why I did that, and that's the reason why. No, it's just based on fear and hate and anger and lust and whatever else, whatever primal urges there are. And at the time when I was listening to him, I felt, for whatever reason, maybe I felt competitive with him and my amygdala was doing its thing. I was just thinking, well, no, Elon, the primitive brain kind of has to run the quote-unquote intelligent brain, because the primitive brain is, like hunger, for example. I don't think that's in the amygdala, but that's a primitive urge that needs to be satisfied. You need sustenance, you need food, so you need to get food. And if it is that you are afraid, maybe you're probably afraid for a good reason, because there's some animal that's a threat and you need to act in terms of flight or fight, and you need to deal with that. At the same time though, I guess that we aren't there yet. The way that natural selection is that most of the creatures, most of the mutations, most of the changes die. They're not useful. And our change is to have this intelligent brain. It has been useful. It's enabled us to rise above instinct, and we are able to evolve faster because our evolution is based on how we model the world. And if we are right about how we model the world, then that's a benefit. And because of language and because of writing, we can pass on that knowledge to another generation, and we can build and change and adapt and mutate to make improvements without having to actually have the whole long process of normal genetic natural selection. But I think, we'll never stop being naturally selected, I don't think, because as long as there's a difference in reproductive rates, whether it's on a macro level or a micro level. And that's another thing too. On a macro level, we are selecting for not the first world countries, because the first world countries have individuals who are supposedly more intelligent and are not breeding as much. So the second and third world countries are the ones that are breeding, and they are being selected for right now. So it's a tangled mess in my mind. Maybe somebody out there has already come up with something that seems more seamless. But I think that when people suggest that we are no longer subject to natural selection, I think maybe they're a physicist or a chemist. They're not probably an anthropologist or somebody dealing with evolutionary science, because once you have more progeny that survive than the other guy, you're being selected for, especially when they're having none to or fewer, like South Korea or Japan or countries all across Europe. If you're not having as many kids, then you're not being selected for. So, you can have the power, but I think there was one other, and it, I still have to figure out how this fits in. But in terms of ideas and culture, when you have let's call it an incestuous creation of new ideas, meaning that people in the first world are not necessarily going to look to the third world to get their ideas. But if you have that kind of inbred culture where you're just looking at people on your level, on your quote unquote level, to get ideas from what you should be doing, then it's probably going to have the same outcome as people who are inbred as a result of being in royalty, whether it's the Egyptians or the Maya or in European countries. Inbred individuals and states even, I would think, they're probably not going to fare that well. But in terms of a society and in terms of an individual's philosophy that can take us from being, because right now I think we are unicellular individuals. We're not any part of a larger body. We pretty much would never die to save, the country. But anyway, this is taking too long, but I find the whole subject to be very interesting. And if you can wish me luck, you can like or unlike, comment, subscribe, and or share. Peace.